Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. We would like to begin by telling you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe in God. We believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that He came in the flesh so that whosoever would believe in Him would not perish but have everlasting life. And that you too can be saved from your sins by confessing Jesus as Lord and believing in your heart that God raised Him from the dead. If you would like some more information on what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we will have a link in the description below that you can go to for a full gospel presentation. And it will also give you an opportunity to respond to the gospel and let us know if you've made a decision today. And we look forward to you doing that. Today we are going to continue on in our study of the book of Romans. And in our study of the book of Romans, we are in session 10. And in session 10 it is called Mercy. And we'll be looking at Romans 11:17 through 32. So again, the title of our time together today is Mercy, and we will be in Romans 11, starting in verse 17 and going through verse 32. Now, we want to begin with a question, as we always do. And as we begin with a question, we want to encourage you to have a discussion in your home. If you are watching this by yourself, get a pen and a paper, and maybe whenever we ask a question, pause the video and write some things down, write your thoughts down, and just to kind of help you to participate and follow along. If you are watching this as a family, maybe you have your spouse with you, or your kids, or maybe even your parents with you. We want to encourage you to pause the video, have a discussion, and we will kind of take a break, and you can pause it, and then we will come back and we will continue on in our Bible study today. So our first question for today is, when was the last time that you felt like you were on the when was the last time that you felt like you were on the outside looking in? Or really, can you think of any time that you were on the outside looking in? And then with that, what did it feel like? What do you remember the emotions that you experienced when you suddenly realized that you were very much so on the outside looking in? Take a moment, pause the video, and have a conversation with that as a family. Okay, hopefully you've had some time to discuss that. I know that's something that is always a hard thing for us to think about, of times where we really kind of realized that we were on the outside looking in. I know for my part, one of the most defining times when I felt like I was on the outside looking in, I was attending a Christian club, if you will, and was going there to meet a friend and kind of get to know the area. And by the time I showed up, they really kind of already had their groups, and everybody kind of knew each other, and everybody was kind of on the inside. And even though I was coming in and I knew people, and I'm a fairly outgoing individual, and I was even then when I was in high school, I began to realize very quickly that because they didn't know me, they really didn't need me there. And so as much as I'm pretty good about getting in conversations and being a part of the story, I realized very quickly that everybody there was kind of doing what they kind of felt like was their Christian duty, and would shake my hand and say they were glad to have me, but then ultimately everybody went back to their circles. And even when I tried to go and be a part of the circle, it was very clear that I wasn't. And I remember feeling horribly uncomfortable. I remember feeling very, very anxious for my friends, the people I knew, to actually show up and to allow me to be a part of it. And then ultimately, when I kind of left that place, I just kind of felt like I didn't really matter, that I wasn't really worth anything. And that was a very frustrating thing. If you'll remember, as we are going into the book of Romans, that we are still in that kind of in-between stage. If you remember, we said that the first 8 chapters of Romans are dealing with theology. It's talking about who God is, who we are, what God has done to save us. It's really kind of establishing the beliefs and what we need to know about God. And if we think about the third part that we start in chapter 12, we start to get into the practical application of what does this mean? Because God is this, because God has done this for us, because this is the character and the nature of God, therefore we are to do this, we are to live this way, and we are to respond in this way. Very, very typical for Paul. We talked about it last week, for him to say, kind of start with theology and then move on into application. But again, we're in actually that middle ground where you're in, starting in chapter 9 and moving through chapter 11, where Paul is really dealing with this issue of this question of what about the Jews? Where do the Jews stand in this? What is their place? What is their role in all of this? And we're going to start to see why he's having this specific conversation with the Roman Christians, because some of the things he's addressing in our passage today are going to really show what maybe the problem was and why Paul needed to address the place and the role of Israel, of ethnic Israel, in the role of the church. Having said that, we're going to kind of get right into our text. You'll kind of notice that the first half of Romans 11 is really dealing with that and dealing with that question of what about the Jews, what's going on, what has happened with them. And then as we jump into our passage today and start getting into it, we're going to start to see almost immediately Paul is going to be jumping into this analogy, and he's going to be giving this analogy of vines and olive branches and all of that type of stuff. And they want to kind of explain that. The book really wants us to kind of explain that up front. And what we have here is just basically three significant things that we need to address, and three things that he talks about. He talks about the wild olive, the wild olive branch. He talks about the cultivated olive branch, and then he talks about the root. And what we know about this is kind of dealing with agriculture and dealing with husbandry and plants and stuff like that. And what we know about how they would raise olives and how they would do grafting, which is the term that they're going to be talking about here, how they would do grafting with olive trees is a lot of times cultivated olives, cultivated olive vines and olive plants often produced better olives. They were bigger. They were more likely what we would see in a jar today. They just produced a better fruit. And while there were still wild olive plants, and you could find wild olives out there, more often than not, those olives were very tiny. They probably would have had a very large pit in them. They wouldn't have been much good for eating. And so over time, Israel and a lot of people in this area would have cultivated better olives and that. But the catch is cultivated olives, a lot of times, their root structure was not very good. And so one of the things that they had learned to do was to take cultivated olive branches and graft those into wild olive plants. And what that would do is it would give the better fruit of the cultivated olive, but grafting it into the sturdy, more resilient root system of a wild olive plant in order to have a much better crop and in order for all of it to go better. Now, what Paul is going to do in our passage today is he's going to flip that. Probably knowing full well that that's not actually how you did it, he's going to flip that. He's going to turn that and use that, though, as an example, as what has happened with Israel and with the Gentiles. And in our passage today, we're going to realize that the wild olive branch that he talks about is talking about the Gentiles, that they were the kind of the one outside, the one that had not been connected to God, and they are actually going to be grafted into the cultivated plant, and the cultivated branch is actually going to represent Israel in this time, in the time that they're writing, and maybe even extend that out to our time today. And then so you have the two branches. You have the wild branch, which is the Gentiles. You have the cultivated branch, which is Israel. And then you have the root. And the root that it's talking about here is the root of the full relationship between God and Israel as it grows up. And so the root of this cultivated plant represents God and his relationship with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It has to do with Joshua and Samuel and David and Solomon. It's all of that. It's all the ways that God worked through the nation of Israel to bring about and to accomplish his work. And that is going to be the root and the foundation of everything that comes out of this olive tree from this point forward. And so as we get into our text today, we're going to see that. We're going to see that explained. And I want you to kind of understand that those are the analogies, those are the connections that we find here. And I want you to, let's start in verse, I want to read just very quickly verse 13, because that helps us understand to whom Paul is talking. Now remember, Paul is writing to the church in Rome. He has never been to the church in Rome. This whole letter is kind of that kind of letter of passage saying, hey, I'm coming when I get there, will you help me kind of keep on my way and keep going? So we're in Romans chapter 11. I'm going to start in verse 13 and just kind of help and just very quickly just show you who he's talking to. Now he says this. He says, "Now I am speaking to you Gentiles insofar that I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry." And so kind of before we even get into our text, understand that that's who he's talking about. He's talking about the Gentile believers that lived in Rome. Now, this is something that will probably, for everybody watching this, or almost everybody watching this, this is going to be significant for us as well because we're Gentile believers. Almost everybody that I'm aware of at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church, and maybe the vast majority of the people that may be watching this video are Gentile believers. They don't have any Jewish history. They're not coming from a Jewish family, not a Jewish family that has come to know Christ and continued in that, nor are they Jews who have heard the gospel and believed and received Christ. There may be a few. I think there might be a few that listen, but more than likely, everybody listening to this video today is going to be a Gentile believer, and therefore, this is definitely something we should take in as well. So let's pick up in verse 17, and we are going to read verses 17 through 21 together. So Romans 11, starting at verse 17, says this: "Now, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them, and have come to share in the rich root of the cultivated olive tree, do not boast that you are better than those branches. But if you do boast, you do not sustain the root, but the root sustains you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True enough. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but beware. Because if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either." Okay, so we have a lot going on there and a lot that we really need to discuss in our passage. And so first thing we have to do is we really need to identify the parts. And we've talked about that already. So in this passage, just with your family or at your home, I want you to kind of go back over this verse and just identify the parts of the olive tree or the olive vine that he specifically identifies in this passage. So just take a moment, pause the video, and just kind of discuss that with your group, and maybe even take it one step further and kind of say, okay, these are the things that we see identified, and maybe again just what they represent. We've already told you that, but maybe just for review that again. Okay, so we should have, if we look at that, if we kind of identify what those pieces are, we have the wild olive branches. That's the first thing that we see in there, is those wild olive branches. Actually, that's not true, but we do see those, the wild olive branches, and that represents us. That represents Gentile believers. We're the wild olive branches. But even before that, it actually mentions those branches that had been broken off. So we have the branches that are broken off, we have the wild olive branches, and then we have the root, the rich root. And so if you remember what we said before, the broken off olive branches, they were cultivated branches, they were there, but they've been broken off. This is the nation of Israel that has rejected Christ. They are people that are wanting to stand in the law, wanting to stand in their own righteousness, wanting to still live by, temple worship and the keeping of the law, but they have rejected Christ. And because they have rejected Christ, these are branches that have been pruned away, that have been cut off from the whole tree, from the whole olive tree. Then there are the wild branches, and he specifies very quickly that this is you. This is the Gentile believer, that those are, he's talking to the people that he is addressing, that he's writing this to. And he's saying, you are the wild olive branch. And then he talks about this rich root, and that is what we said before. That is God and his relationship with Israel. It is all of the history of Israel. I kind of view that rich root as really the whole Old Testament. That God has been working through his chosen people, working through Israel from Genesis all the way to Malachi when you think about the Old Testament. But certainly if we kind of start with God making that specific covenant with Abraham, from Abraham all the way through to when we get to Jesus, that is God working through all of those people to reveal his plan and to reveal his word. this is a wonderful, beautiful relationship. And let me ask you this question. This is something for you to discuss with your family. Why was it important for Paul to remind the Gentile believers to refrain from boasting about their salvation? So if we look at the passage, let me explain that just a little bit. If we look at that passage, he's talking about how they were grafted in, that some were pruned, but others were grafted in. And then he says this statement in verse 18. He says, "Do not boast that you are better than the other branches, but if you do boast, know that you are sustained by the root, and the root doesn't sustain you." So he specifically says into them, he says, listen, you should not boast over these other people because you don't contribute to the overall health of the root or you don't contribute to the rest of the plant. You're there to do your part, but it's actually the root that is nourishing you. It is the root that's taking care of you. So it is this history, it is this Old Testament, it's this full revelation of God that is going to be the thing that is guiding you and directing you and causing you to bear fruit. Don't think it's just you, that you're the essential piece. You're not. You're a part of the bigger picture, and you're a part of this healthy root. Why is that important for the Gentiles to remember? So think about that for a second. Discuss that with your family. Pause the video and answer the question, why was it important that Paul remind the Gentile believers to refrain from boasting about their salvation? So take a couple seconds. Okay, as we come back, we see here that Paul was reminding the Gentiles that their salvation was all about God's grace and not about anything that they had actually accomplished or contributed. The Gentiles should have expressed gratitude and not pride. And so what we're seeing there and what Paul is communicating in this passage is that you have been saved by grace through faith. It's not that you did anything, but that God did something grand and God brought you into the vine in this case, or God has brought you into the family of God by his own grace. And therefore your response to that shouldn't be that, well, I've done something great, or I'm special, or I'm wonderful, but rather that God is good and that God is wonderful and that God has blessed me richly. So let's keep going on, and we're going to be getting into Romans 11, starting in verse 22 and through 24. But I want to, before we do that, I want to kind of get an image in your head, and that's kind of the image of a scale. And so I've kind of got a ruler here, and when you have a scale, basically what you have is you have some sort of balance there, something to kind of balance out the two things. And you see this in a scale. In order to kind of measure or weigh things, you're going to put some weight on one side, or you're going to put some weight on the other side. And the goal is eventually to get the weight, if you've got your weights on this side and your product on the other, is to find this balance between the two. And that's going to ultimately tell you how much something weighs. And so I want you to kind of have this idea of this balance in your head as we get into the next two passages. And I want you to kind of answer the question as we read this. What are the two things that God is wanting to balance? What is he putting on this side? What is he putting on that side to help people understand really the full character and who God is? So let's take a look at that together, and let's look at verses 22 through 24. So starting in verse 22, it says this: "Therefore, consider God's kindness and severity. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness towards you, if you remain in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they remain in unbelief, if they do not remain in unbelief, will be grafted in, because God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from your native wild olive tree, and against nature were grafted into the cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?" So here we have two attributes of God that he is balancing out. Take a couple seconds, take a couple minutes, discuss these two things and what they are and what they're directed towards, and then come back and we'll have a conversation about them. Okay, so what two attributes do we see Paul talking about in this passage? Hopefully in your discussions today, you have discovered that one is his kindness, This is one we're pretty familiar with. We talk about this a lot, and hopefully it's something that you kind of expected. But the other one is his severity. So let's talk about what those mean. So first off, it's kindness. It's kindness to whom? Specifically in our passage, it's kindness towards the Gentile believers. Now you may ask why. Why is he showing kindness? Why is he showing grace to the Gentile believers? And the answer is quite simply because of their faith, because of their belief. That he is showing kindness towards Gentile believers because they're believers. Really because they have put their faith and their hope and trust, and therefore he has forgiven their sin, forgiven the fact that they have walked away from God and that they have sinned in their lives, and he has forgiven that. He has shown them grace and kindness and brought them into the family of God. But along with that comes severity. And that severity comes from a rejection of the same thing, that they have rejected Jesus as the Christ, that they have rejected God because they have rejected Jesus as the Christ. And because of their rejection, they have been, as our passage says, they have been cut off, that they have been removed from the family of God, and that they are going to prepare, they are going to receive that full wrath that comes with that. Some stuff to kind of think about. And just kind of questions for you to discuss is, how would you describe the balance between God's severity and his kindness? So if you think about that in your life, and as we understand God today, how do you see that balance, or how would you explain that balance between God's severity and his kindness? Maybe even asking that question of maybe an unbeliever or someone that might have just kind of a very limited understanding of God. How would you go about explaining to an unbeliever, or maybe someone that's still learning about God, or even just one of your kids, about how God has this balance between his kindness and his goodness, but also his severity and what we see in this passage? So take a couple minutes, discuss that as a family, and then we'll come back and move into our next passage. Okay, so hopefully you've had some good discussion about that. I want to read what the book says, because it's just a one-sentence thing. It's pretty succinct, but I think it says it very well. And it's this: is God is not so kind that he overlooks evil. So he is kind, God is kind, but he is not so kind that he is going to overlook evil. He's just going to kind of just pretend like he doesn't see it and just not deal with evil. Nor is he so harsh that he would condemn without cause. So when we think about this balance between kindness and severity, we need to understand that God, that in the midst of all this, we see his justice. See, God is a loving God, but God is also a holy God, and he is a just God. And so God shows kindness, and he shows love and grace and mercy, but he will not, and indeed because of his very nature, he cannot overlook sin. But he doesn't just punish without cause. He is not just, God doesn't have bad days where he just sets out to hurt people. It's not like he punishes us or anyone else without cause, but rather he is always wanting to show grace, wanting to show mercy, but always dealing with sin because he knows that sin must be dealt with. Paul believes that Israel's rejection of the gospel is not a final thing. We're going to read here in Romans chapter 11. We're going to read verses 25 through 29. And as we do so, I want to invite you to notice the roles of the Jews and the Gentiles and how they play in demonstrating that all people have an opportunity to receive God's salvation. So let's take a look at that. We're going to be in Romans chapter 11, starting in verse 25. Starting in 25, it says this. It says, "I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, that you will not, so that you will not be conceited. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel would be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Make sure I read all of it here through 29. "Regarding the gospel, they are enemies for your advantage. But regarding election, they are loved because of the patriarchs, since God's gracious gifts and calling are irrevocable." Okay, so as we get into this, there's a lot going on here, and he's talking a lot about what is happening here. And so I'm going to read what the book says because I think it will be helpful. And it says this. It says, "God's plan has always been based on faith. Since God has all authority, he can graft anyone who has expressed faith God has done it for the Gentiles, and he will do it for the Jews if they would overcome their lack of faith. He believed, Paul believed that the day was coming, and he illustrated this belief by quoting the prophecy of Isaiah in verses 26 and further explaining it in verses 28 and 29, how God would bring together the good, bring all these things together for good and for his glory. So what he's saying here, and what's happening in this passage is he's articulated the point that some of Israel had been cut off, that some of Israel had fallen away because of the fact that they rejected Christ, that God had been working through Israel. He had done so all the way up to Jesus' day, and had been revealing himself and working through the people of Israel, that they had been his witness and his people on the earth, and that when Christ came, which was the culmination of all of that salvation and that grace and that a relationship with God was then very much so extended to all people through the gospel. It was always there, but it was clearly communicated. Paul had become a minister to this end, and even as Paul was doing ministry, they were seeing two things happen. One, they were seeing Israel having their heart hardened towards the gospel and that they were rejecting the Christ, but they were seeing the Jews hear the good news of the gospel and believe in that and come to know Christ and come to saving faith. What Paul is saying in this passage is this has happened, but ultimately God is still going to call Israel to himself. That God is still going to offer that gospel witness and offer that gospel message to the Jews, and that God was going to ultimately bring about a nation or a people unto himself that would be filled with both Gentile believers and Jewish believers. And that was his hope, and that was his desire even at that time. And so he talks about that. He uses he quotes from Isaiah to talk about how God is going to bring all them together and basically bring about this idea that it's not that God is completely abandoning Israel, but rather he is calling everyone to saving faith through Christ, whether they are Jew or Gentile. All right, we're going to get into our last section. Now we're going to read just verses 30 through 32. As we do this, I want you guys to take note of every time you see the word mercy. So every time you see the word mercy in verses 30 through 32, and it says this. It says, "As you once disobeyed, as you have once disobeyed God, but now have received mercy through their disobedience, so they too have now disobeyed, resulting in mercy to you, so that they also may now receive mercy. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may have mercy on all." So quite a few times do we see the word mercy in here. And what we're seeing in this passage is God is accomplishing his perfect will through what's going on in Rome and what's going on in this whole section. And the idea is that God had sent his only son to provide grace and mercy to all who would believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what has happened is because of that grace and mercy, it started with the Gentiles who were disobedient to God, who didn't know God, who lived by their own ways, who followed idols. They received mercy by hearing the gospel. That unfortunately the Jews ultimately in many ways were rejecting that gospel, and that was allowing the mercy of God to flow very quickly into Gentile groups and into Gentile cities, and Gentiles were seeing grace, experiencing grace and being saved through this, that God's mercy was being lavished upon the Gentiles at this time, but that just like the Gentiles were once disobedient and received mercy, so too the Jews who were currently being disobedient and rejecting the gospel were also going to receive mercy as they received the gospel and experience that grace and that mercy. God's promise cannot be changed or altered. That's what we see in this passage, that he was committed to following through on his restoration of the world through his grace and mercy, that he is restoring the world. He is restoring, not destroying. He is restoring both Jew and Gentile, that he is calling the whole world, all of creation, people from every tribe, tongue, and nation to have a relationship with him. And he was doing that through Israel. He was been doing that that through Israel, now that that ministry had moved into the Gentile realm and was being preached and proclaimed freely in the Gentile world as well as the Jewish world. But the plan was and has always been that both Jew and Gentile would hear the good news of the gospel and be saved by it. I want to leave you with one final thing to discuss, as we've done in the past, and it's this question: how does God offer salvation through faith in Jesus alone, show his justice and his mercy? And what does God's plan, being irrevocable, tell us about his character? So in this passage, I want to read that last verse for you again, and then let these questions be what you kind of spend the last bit of your time discussing. He says this: "For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may have mercy on all." And this is something that he says just a few passages earlier. This is something irrevocable. This is something that's not going away. And so God has, all of us have been imprisoned, all of us have been condemned under the law, but that has happened so that all of us can be made free through grace in Christ, through the mercy that he shows us through the gospel. And knowing that that is true, knowing that God's offer of salvation through faith in Jesus alone shows both his justice and mercy, how does God's plan, being irrevocable, tell us about his character and nature? So take a couple minutes, discuss that as a family. Close off your time in prayer today, and I hope this has been a blessing to you. We look forward to seeing you and to hearing from you very, very soon. Again, if you would like more information about making Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, you will find a link to a full gospel presentation in the description below. Otherwise, we will see you in just a few minutes as we join together for online worship. Thank you so much, and have a great day, and God bless.